My name is Sarah Chen. I was 31 years old when my body finally stopped cooperating with the life I had built for everyone else. At the time, I was a pediatric ICU nurse at St. Mary's Medical Center. Night shifts, 12 to 16 hours at a stretch. Divorced, mother of 5-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan. I lived with them in a single-room studio apartment 15 minutes from the hospital because proximity mattered more than space. I drove a 2008 Honda Civic with 210,000 miles on it and a check engine light that came on only when it felt like reminding me who was really in charge. I had been doing this version of life for 9 years. 9 years of being the reliable one. At work, that reliability had a shape. I was the nurse charge assigned the sickest kids, the one called in when alarms went off and voices shook. I didn't panic easily. I charted fast. I noticed small changes before monitors did. When parents collapsed in the hallway, I stayed upright for them. When a child coded at 3 in the morning, my hands didn't tremble. My supervisors trusted me. New nurses followed me. Families remembered my name. At home, reliability looked different. It meant schedules taped to the fridge. It meant grocery lists calculated down to the dollar. It meant teaching 2 children how to be quiet when mommy slept during the day. It meant never missing a daycare pickup, because missing one meant fees I couldn't afford and judgment I didn't have time to explain. And then there was my family. I was the younger child, the practical one, the one who landed on her feet. My older brother David was the golden story, brilliant, ambitious, the doctor in the family, the one everyone pointed to and said he's going to do big things. 9 years earlier, when David was accepted into medical school, the celebration lasted weeks. Dermatology track, competitive program, expensive tuition. Our parents were radiant with pride. I remember my mother crying at the dinner table while rereading the acceptance email like it might disappear if she blinked too long. I had just finished my nursing residency then. I was exhausted, newly licensed, and earning more money than I ever had before. When my parents asked if I could help David just until things stabilized, I didn't hesitate. That's what families do, I thought. They help. The first payment felt harmless, then another, then another. By the time I realized I was paying interest on loans I hadn't taken out, the pattern was already set. Tuition gaps, exam fees, rent near campus. Just this semester. Just until residency. I kept saying yes because saying no would have required a conversation I didn't know how to start. Over 9 years, I paid $180,000 toward my brother's medical school debt. When my parents' finances started to buckle, I helped again. A reverse mortgage was framed as temporary relief, not a collapse. I paid $120,000 to stabilize it. Quiet transfers, no announcements, no thanks needed. They were my parents. Then came David's wedding. $40,000. Venue deposits, catering, last-minute upgrades. I worked double shifts for months to cover it. I stood at the back of the reception hall in my scrubs because I'd come straight from work. David hugged me, distracted, already turning toward another guest. Our parents glowed. No one ever mentioned the money again. David finished residency, then fellowship, then landed a private dermatology position in the suburbs. His salary climbed to $450,000 a year. I learned that from Instagram. Photos appeared of Cabo beaches, ski lodges, conference dinners. His Tesla parked in front of a newly built house with a pool. Our parents reposted everything. So proud of our son, all his hard work paying off. I double-tapped between medication rounds and went back to work. My life narrowed, no vacations, no rest days unless I was sick enough to justify them. I drove the Honda because it still ran. I lived in the studio because it was close. I told myself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, once David was settled, once my parents were comfortable, I'd exhale. But stability kept moving further away. My brother gave advice now, about stress, about balance, about boundaries. He said it casually, confidently from airports and hotel balconies. "You really need to manage your stress better," he told me once. "It's about mindset." I laughed softly and said he was probably right. This is what being the good daughter teaches you, that your capacity is infinite, that your needs are optional. That strength means silence. You become the solution to everyone else's problems and the explanation for your own exhaustion. By year 9, my body started protesting in ways I couldn't chart away. Chest tightness I blamed on caffeine. Headaches I worked through. Fatigue that sleep didn't touch. I cared for children fighting for their lives every night while quietly bargaining with my own heart to hold on a little longer. I kept showing up. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, I clocked in for another double shift. The twins were at daycare. Pickup was at 6 p.m. I had planned it down to the minute, like everything else in my life. At 5:30 p.m., standing outside a patient's room with my chart in hand, the world tilted. Not dramatically, just enough. My vision narrowed. My chest tightened. I reached for the counter to steady myself and realized, with a clarity that cut through everything else, that I could not outwork this moment. For 9 years, I had been the one who carried emergencies. That night, I became one. I didn't faint, I didn't fall. That detail mattered to me at the time, because people who faint get taken seriously immediately, and people who stay upright are expected to keep going. I finished the chart. I told myself it was dehydration, too much coffee, too many nights. I promised my body I'd sit down after one more task. That's the lie I'd learned to live on. Then the pain sharpened. Not dramatic, focused, like something inside my chest had finally decided it was done negotiating. A colleague noticed my face before I noticed my hands shaking. Within minutes, I was on a gurney being wheeled past rooms I'd worked in for years, past nurses who knew my routines, past doctors who trusted my judgment. Someone asked my age twice, like they were checking for a mistake. 31 didn't fit the picture. They ran tests. They spoke in careful tones. Stress-induced cardiac episode, they said. Acute, but not imaginary. Real enough to require intervention. Real enough to need monitoring. Real enough that the room felt smaller when the word procedure was used. I stared at the ceiling tiles and thought of the twins. Emma and Ethan were still at daycare. Pickup was at 6. It was 5:30. I reached for my phone. This was the moment, I told myself. The moment when being the reliable one would finally come back around. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for favors. I was asking for 20 minutes and a car ride. I called my parents first. No answer. I texted the family group chat, the one labeled Chen Family Red, the one that usually filled with photos of David's dinners and my mother's garden updates. I'm in the hospital. I need a procedure. Can you please pick up Emma and Ethan? I watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, reappear. Then my mother replied, "Sarah, you're always so dramatic." I reread it to make sure I hadn't imagined the words. David has a medical conference dinner tonight. We're his guests. Networking matters. Call your ex-husband. David replied next. Maybe if you managed your stress better like I taught you, this wouldn't keep happening. My phone went still. The room didn't. Monitors continued their soft, indifferent beeping. A nurse adjusted my IV. A doctor reviewed my chart. Life moved forward as if nothing fundamental had just shifted. But something had. For the first time, the story I'd been telling myself cracked. Not because of the medical emergency. I could rationalize that. Bodies fail. Stress happens. Nurses burn out. It was the response. The casual dismissal. The assumption that I would figure it out, like always. That even from a hospital bed, I would reroute the problem somewhere else so no one else had to feel inconvenienced. I thought of every transfer I'd made, every shift I'd added, every time I'd said it's fine when it was. And for the first time, I felt something harder than pain. I felt foolish. While they prepped me for monitoring, I asked for my bag, my phone. I needed to check something. I opened the Notes app first, then stopped myself. That wasn't where the truth lived. I opened the spreadsheet. It was titled plainly, Family Support. Rows and columns, dates, amounts, notes, Venmo transfers, Zelle confirmations, checks logged with check numbers because that's how my brain worked. Because if I was going to give this much, I needed to know where it went. I scrolled. 2016, tuition gap. 2017, interest payment. 2018, exam fees. 2019, rent assistance. 2020, mortgage stabilization. 2021, wedding deposit. 2022, catering balance. 2023, emergency parental shortfall. The total sat at the bottom in a cell I rarely looked at. $340,000. I stared at it like it belonged to someone else. No one had ever asked me how much I'd given. No one had ever asked if I could afford it. No one had ever seen this document. A man stepped into the room then, my attending physician, Dr. Rodriguez. I knew him professionally, calm, observant, the kind of doctor who noticed patterns others missed. He looked at the phone in my hand, then at my face. "Sarah," he said gently, "who are these people?" I didn't answer right away. He waited. "My family," I said finally. He glanced at the screen again. "You've been sending them money." "For years." "How long?" 9. He exhaled slowly, like someone taking in a fact that rearranges the room. "And they wouldn't pick up your kids," he said, not a question. Something in his tone made my throat tighten. Not pity, recognition. "Can I see that?" he asked. I handed him the phone. He scrolled, once, twice, then he stopped and looked at me directly. "Sarah," he said carefully, "this isn't support, this is financial abuse." The word landed heavy. Abuse was something that happened to other people, louder people, messier people, people with visible bruises and raised voices and broken plates, not people like me, not people who had spreadsheets and steady jobs and quiet lives. "I chose to help," I said automatically. "They didn't force me." He nodded. Choice doesn't disappear just because pressure is polite. He asked if he could photograph the spreadsheet for my chart notes. I hesitated, then nodded. He documented everything: dates, totals, the messages, the timing. "After your procedure," he said, "I want you to talk to our social worker, and I want you to listen to what they tell you, even if it makes you uncomfortable." I wanted to argue, to minimize, to defend people who had already decided I was inconvenient. Instead, I asked, "Can you help me make sure my kids get picked up?" He did. As they wheeled me toward imaging, my phone buzzed again. A follow-up message from my mother. "We'll talk later. Don't make this a big thing. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever realized all at once that the people you were sacrificing for never planned to sacrifice for you? If you have, comment enough." Just that word, because that's where this story turns. I stared at the ceiling and understood something I hadn't let myself say before. The spreadsheet wasn't proof for them. It was proof for me. And once you see the numbers clearly, you can't unsee the cost. They moved faster once the decision was made. That was the strange part, how quickly my emergency became operational once it was officially named. Consent forms, wristbands, a nurse I knew by first name switching into professional distance. Someone explained the procedure in clean, efficient sentences, like they were reading weather conditions. I nodded. I signed. I asked the same question 3 times because my brain kept drifting back to the same place. "Have the kids been picked up?" "Not yet." It was 5:41 p.m. Daycare closed at 6. Dr. Rodriguez stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing vitals, then looked up. "We've got a social worker calling your emergency contacts now. We'll make sure your children are safe." I believed him. I trusted systems. Systems were what kept people alive at 3 in the morning. But systems didn't raise children. I asked for my phone again. I texted my ex-husband. We were civil, distant, functional when it came to co-parenting. He lived across town. Traffic would be brutal. "I'm in the hospital. Can you get the kids?" The message showed delivered. No reply. At 5:48, my chest tightened again. The monitor chirped. A nurse adjusted something and told me to breathe slowly. I did, because breathing was still one thing I could control. At 5:52, my phone buzzed. I'm stuck at work. I can try, but I can't promise anything. I closed my eyes. This was the moment I finally understood what it meant to have no margin left. Not emotional margin, not financial margin, actual logistical margin. One missed pickup, one delayed car, one unreturned call, and the entire structure collapsed. At 5:55, the social worker arrived. Efficient, calm, she had already called the daycare director, explained the situation, arranged a late pickup. There would be a fee. She told me gently, like it might matter. I nodded. Fees were familiar. They were predictable. They didn't surprise me anymore. As they prepped me for the procedure, I caught fragments of conversation. Young, stress, single parent. No one said the words family support out loud, but it hovered there, unspoken and conspicuous by its absence. They wheeled me into the procedure room just after 6. Bright lights, sterile air, a clock on the wall ticking with unreasonable confidence. Someone asked me to rate my pain. I gave it a number because that's what patients do. As the medication took hold, my thoughts narrowed. Not to fear, to inventory. Who would feed the kids tonight? Whether Emma remembered her spelling words. If Ethan's jacket was still at daycare. How much the late fee would be. Whether I'd have to swap shifts again to cover it. This is what stress looks like when it's lived in. Not panic, management. I woke up later in recovery, groggy and intact. Dr. Rodriguez stood nearby, reviewing results. Procedure went well, he said. You're stable. Relief washed through me, brief and incomplete. And the kids? I asked. They're safe, he said. The social worker picked them up and stayed with them until your ex arrived. My chest loosened for the first time that night. After he left, I lay there listening to the machines, thinking about the spreadsheet, about the word abuse, about how calmly my family had dismissed me when I needed them most. The truth was settling in, not loudly but firmly. I had built my life around availability, emotional, financial, logistical, and trained everyone around me to expect it, including myself. Around 9 that night, my phone buzzed again. A message from my father this time. Your mother is very upset. This could have waited. We'll talk tomorrow. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Could have waited. My heart hadn't agreed. The social worker came back later, sitting beside the bed like someone who understood the weight of silence. Sarah, she said, what support do you have outside your family? The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because no one had ever asked it before. I work, I said finally. I manage. She nodded. Managing isn't the same as being supported. She explained things I'd never considered myself eligible for. Counseling, financial abuse resources, legal consultations if I wanted them. Not because anyone had stolen from me, but because coercion doesn't always raise its voice. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't commit to anything yet, but I didn't dismiss it either. That was new. Later, when the floor quieted, I opened my phone again and scrolled through David's Instagram. A new story was up. A photo of a linen-covered table, wine glasses catching light. Captioned, "Great conversations tonight." Posted 30 minutes after my procedure began. I didn't feel anger the way I expected to. I felt clarity. For years, I had believed that if I just explained myself better, worked harder, stayed calmer, things would even out. That generosity would eventually be reciprocated. That love, once proven, would be returned. But love that only moves in one direction isn't love. It's extraction. At 11:17 p.m., I opened a new note on my phone and titled it something different. Boundaries. It was empty. But for the first time, that emptiness felt like possibility instead of failure. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know about the party, or the envelope, or the truth that had been waiting longer than I had. All I knew lying there in a hospital bed while my children slept somewhere else, was this. The life I had been living was unsustainable. And whether my family liked it or not, something had already changed. I was discharged the next afternoon, with instructions I had given to patients hundreds of times. Rest, reduce stress, follow up with cardiology, avoid overexertion. I nodded like I always did, thanked everyone, and walked out carrying a discharge folder and the quiet knowledge that my life did not have room for any of that. The twins ran to me when I got home. Emma asked why I smelled like the hospital. Ethan wanted to know if I had brought pudding cups. I hugged them too tightly and promised myself I'd do better without knowing what better actually meant. That night, after they were asleep, I opened the family group chat again. I hadn't planned to. I told myself I was just checking for updates, but part of me needed to reread the words to confirm they were real, that I hadn't hallucinated cruelty under medication. You're always so dramatic. Networking matters. Manage your stress better. The timestamps were there, the context, the silence afterward. For years, I had defended my family to myself by telling a softer story. They didn't mean it like that. They were busy. They assumed I could handle things. They trusted me because I was capable. This time, the words didn't bend. They sat there, blunt and intact. The next morning, my mother called. Her voice was brisk, already irritated. "We need to talk about yesterday." I waited. "You scared everyone," she said. "You could have handled that better." I asked quietly, "Better how?" A pause. Then, "You didn't need to involve the hospital like that." I closed my eyes. "I didn't involve them," I said. "I was already there." She sighed like I was being deliberately obtuse. "You know what I mean. You always escalate things." That word again, dramatic, escalate. I told her about the diagnosis, about the procedure, about the social worker picking up the twins. She acknowledged none of it. "What are we supposed to do?" she said. "Drop everything every time you feel overwhelmed." I felt something inside me go still. "I wasn't overwhelmed," I said. "I was having a cardiac event." Silence stretched thin. "Well," she said finally, "you need to learn to pace yourself. David has real responsibilities now." There it was. The hierarchy, stated plainly. I ended the call without raising my voice, without defending myself, without promising to do better. My father texted later, "Your mother is sensitive. You know how she gets. Don't make this into a bigger issue." David didn't call at all. That afternoon, while the twins were at daycare, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened the spreadsheet again. Not to add anything, to review it like an auditor would, without excuses, without family labels. Dates, amounts, frequency. Patterns. What struck me wasn't just the total. It was the timing. The way requests clustered around David's milestones and my exhaustion. Finals, boards, wedding, house purchase. Each ask framed as urgent, temporary, necessary. Each one answered by me. I cross-referenced the transfers with my work schedule. Double shifts, overtime, holidays, nights I'd missed school events because something came up. I hadn't just funded their lives. I had structured mine around their needs. When Dr. Rodriguez called to check in, I told him about the conversation with my mother. He listened without interrupting. "Do you still have the messages?" he asked. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Don't delete anything." That night I took screenshots, the group chat, the timestamps, the responses. I saved them in a folder labeled Medical Incident, Family Communication. It felt clinical, necessary. Before I tell you what those messages eventually became evidence for, I need to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone showed you, in plain language, exactly where you ranked in their life? If you have, type, "I saw it." Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The days that followed were quiet on the surface and loud underneath. My parents didn't call. David posted more photos, a caption about balance and gratitude. I stopped reacting, stopped explaining, stopped offering updates. At work, people noticed the difference before I did. I said no to an extra shift. I asked for coverage. I took my full break and didn't apologize for it. It felt wrong, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. But the real rupture came a week later, when my mother forwarded an invitation. 40th anniversary celebration. Country club. Formal attire. Family and friends welcome. At the bottom, a note, "Your father wants everyone there. It's important." I stared at the screen, reading between the lines. Important for appearances. Important for speeches. Important for reinforcing the story they liked telling. I typed back, "I'll check my schedule." It was the first time. I hadn't immediately said yes. That night, after the twins were asleep, I opened my phone and reread the texts one last time. Not with hurt, with distance. They weren't just unkind. They were honest. And honesty, even when it wounds, has a way of clearing space. I didn't know yet that this party would become a reckoning, that someone else had been watching all along, that the truth I'd been carrying quietly had already been written down, sealed, and waiting. All I knew was this: the lie that had held my family together, the lie that I was fine, that I didn't need anything, that my role was to give, had finally collapsed. And nothing that came next would be built on it again. The first appointment I kept wasn't cardiology. It was the hospital social worker. Dr. Rodriguez had insisted I see before I talked myself out of it. Her office was small, windowless, and intentionally plain. No inspirational quotes, no soft music, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a yellow legal pad already open when I walked in. She didn't ask me how I was feeling. She asked me to tell her what happened, in order. So I did. I told her about the collapse at 5:30, about the daycare clock ticking louder than the monitors, about the group chat. I repeated the words exactly as they were written because she asked me to. No paraphrasing, no softening. When I finished, she didn't react the way people usually did. She didn't rush to reassure me. She didn't say families are complicated. She didn't ask what I thought I could have done differently. She asked one question: "How long have they relied on you like this?" 9 years, I said. "And how much money?" I hesitated, then told her. She wrote the number down and circled it once. "Do you have records?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "You're going to keep them." She explained the term again, financial abuse, but this time she broke it down without drama. Patterns of obligation. Guilt framed as duty. Requests timed around vulnerability. Praise replacing reciprocity. Dependence masked as gratitude. "What makes it hard to see," she said, "is that you're competent. People assume competence equals consent." That sentence lodged somewhere deep. She asked about my grandmother. I hadn't mentioned her, which surprised me. "Families like this often have one person who notices," she said, "sometimes quietly." My grandmother had been quiet. She lived in a small house 2 towns over, kept cash in envelopes, watched everything. She used to ask me questions no one else did: if I was tired, if I was eating, if anyone helped me. I'd always said yes. The social worker nodded, like she'd expected that answer. She gave me a checklist: counseling resources, financial advocacy, a recommendation to speak to a lawyer, not to sue, she clarified, but to understand options. Boundaries, when money is involved, often need structure to hold. Before I left, she said something that changed how I understood the last 9 years. "People don't usually wake up one day and decide to exploit someone," she said. "They follow the path that's easiest. You made it easy by being reliable." Reliable. The word I'd worn like armor suddenly felt heavier. A week later, Dr. Rodriguez asked if I could meet him briefly after my follow-up, not as a patient, as a person. He had printed copies of the documentation he'd added to my chart, the spreadsheet photos, the message timestamps, the clinical notes describing the stressors surrounding the event. "I wanted you to have this," he said, "in case anyone ever tries to rewrite what happened." I thanked him, then asked why he'd been so direct that night. He didn't answer immediately. "I see this pattern a lot," he said finally. "But usually, the patient minimizes it so well that even I start to doubt myself. You didn't." That wasn't true, I thought. I had minimized it for years. But not anymore. That evening, my Uncle James called. My father's older brother, retired FBI agent. The family's designated fixer when things went wrong quietly. We weren't close, but he'd always been observant in a way that felt deliberate. "I heard you were hospitalized," he said. "I wanted to check on you." We talked for a few minutes about logistics, the kids, my recovery. Then he asked, "Did anyone come through for you?" I didn't answer right away. He didn't rush me. "No," I said. Another pause. "I figured," he said. "Listen, I've been meaning to talk to you, maybe after your parents' anniversary." Something in his tone made me straighten. "About what?" "About your grandmother," he said, "and something she left." I felt a flicker of surprise, quickly tamped down. My grandmother had died 2 years earlier. The estate had been handled. David had mentioned investments in passing. I'd assumed everything went to my parents. "Your grandmother was sharper than people gave her credit for," Uncle James continued. "She noticed things. She wrote things down." My pulse picked up, not with hope but with curiosity. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "Because you're finally ready to hear it," he said. We agreed to talk more after the party. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. Before I tell you what my uncle was talking about, I need to pause here. If you've ever been the dependable one, the fixer, the giver, the person everyone leans on, comment, I carried it. Because this part of the story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when someone finally sees the weight you've been holding. The anniversary party loomed closer. RSVPs rolled in. My mother sent updates about seating charts and speeches. David posted a countdown story from another conference. No one asked if I was coming. They assumed. In the days before the party, I organized my documents, printed the spreadsheet, backed up the messages, filed the medical notes. It felt strange, preparing evidence for something no one had accused me of. But something inside me had shifted from defense to readiness. At work, I passed Dr. Rodriguez in the hallway. He smiled, small and knowing. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I am," I said. And for the first time, I meant it, not because things were resolved, but because I wasn't pretending they were fine. I didn't know yet what my grandmother had done, or why she'd trusted my uncle to hold it, or how public the truth was about to become. But I knew this. I was no longer alone in seeing what had been happening. And once a pattern is witnessed, it loses its power to stay invisible. The country club sat on a hill, overlooking a lake I'd only ever seen from the road. White columns, valet parking, a banner stretched across the entrance, 40 years of love and family. I arrived alone. Not because no one could come with me, but because I needed to walk in clear-headed. No buffer, no witness who belonged to my side, just me showing up exactly as I was. Inside, the room hummed with practiced celebration. Linen tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where voices never rose and discomfort was managed quietly, behind smiles. My parents' friends filled the space, doctors, business partners, couples who'd vacationed together for decades. People who believed a very specific version of my family. My mother spotted me first. Her smile was immediate and brittle. "There you are," she said, kissing my cheek. "I was worried you might make things awkward by not coming." "I said I'd check my schedule," I replied. She waved it off. "Well, you're here now. Try to enjoy yourself." David arrived 20 minutes later, exactly on time for applause. He looked effortless, tailored suit, confident stride, the same smile he used in photos calibrated for admiration. People turned toward him automatically, hands reached out, laughter followed. "Dr. Chen," someone called, "we were just talking about you." He shook hands, accepted praise, Moved through the room like this was what he'd trained for all along. He hugged me briefly when we crossed paths. "Hey," he said, "you good?" "Yes," I said. He nodded, already scanning the room. "Good." Dinner was served. Speeches began. Stories about sacrifice and perseverance and how proud my parents were of the life they'd built and the children they'd raised. When my father stood, the room quieted. "Tonight," he said, "is about legacy." I felt my shoulders tense. He talked about family values, about hard work, about supporting one another. Heads nodded. Glasses clinked softly. Then he said it. "We're proud to announce that David will inherit our estate and the lake house. He's earned it with his success." Applause broke out. I didn't move. I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to the sound of a story locking itself into place. Earned it. Around me, people leaned toward David. Congratulations. Jokes about summer weekends. My mother beamed like this was the natural order of things restored. A hand touched my arm. I turned to see Uncle James, standing beside my chair. "Walk with me," he said quietly. We stepped away from the tables, toward a side hallway lined with framed photos of the club's history. He waited until we were alone. "I need you to listen carefully," he said. "Your grandmother left something for you. She made me executor of that portion of her estate. I was instructed not to release it until tonight." I stared at him. "Tonight." "She wanted witnesses," he said, "and she wanted timing." He reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. Heavy, cream-colored, my name written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "Open it," he said, "but not yet. I'm going to ask for the floor." My heart began to race, not with fear, but with a strange sense of alignment, like something long out of place was finally sliding home. "James," I said, "what is this?" "She saw what they were doing to you," he said simply, "and she documented it." We returned to the room just as dessert plates were being cleared. My father was still basking in attention. David laughed at something someone whispered. Uncle James cleared his throat. It wasn't loud, but it was practiced. "Before we wrap up," he said, "I'd like to say a few words." The room stilled, more out of respect for his reputation than expectation. "I was close with my mother," he continued. "Closer than most of you realized. And before she passed, she asked me to hold on to something until the right moment." My mother's smile faltered. "This is that moment." He turned toward me. "Sarah, would you like to join me?" Every eye in the room shifted. I stood. The envelope felt warm in my hand, like it had been waiting for this. "Before I tell you what was inside, I need to ask you something. Have you ever sat in a room where everyone believed a story about you that wasn't true and realized you were about to change it? If you have, comment, 'They didn't know.' Because what came next didn't just rewrite a will. It rewrote a narrative." Uncle James faced the room. "My mother left a letter," he said, "and she instructed me to read it aloud." My father took a step forward. "James, this isn't." "It is," Uncle James said calmly, "and you know it." He unfolded the letter. And as he began to read, I watched my parents' faces change, not with confusion, but with recognition. They knew this was coming. They just hadn't expected it to arrive like this. The paper sounded louder than it should have when Uncle James unfolded it. That's the detail I remember most. Not the room, not the faces, not even my own breathing, but the thin rasp of a letter being opened in a place designed to absorb sound. Conversations had stopped. Forks rested midair. Somewhere, a server froze beside a tray of untouched coffee cups. Uncle James didn't rush. "My mother asked that this be read exactly as written," he said. "No summaries, no edits." My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hands clasped together, knuckles whitening. David stared straight ahead, the way he did when he was being photographed and wanted control over the angle. The letter began with my grandmother's handwriting, translated into Uncle James's steady voice. "To my family. If you are hearing this, It means you have gathered to celebrate longevity. I hope you will also consider honesty." A ripple moved through the room, nothing dramatic, just a collective recalibration. People leaned in. Phones went face down. Attention sharpened. I have watched quietly for many years, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be certain. Uncle James paused, just long enough for the words to land. "Sarah has been the spine of this family since she was a child. While others were praised, she was relied upon. While others were protected, she absorbed the cost." My mother inhaled sharply. Someone at the far table whispered my name. Uncle James continued. "Over the last 9 years, Sarah has paid $180,000 toward David's medical school debt. She has paid $120,000 toward stabilizing the family mortgage. She paid $40,000 for David's wedding." A murmur spread, low and immediate. Uncle James didn't look up. He read the numbers again, slower this time, as if repetition made them more real. This was not generosity freely given. It was obligation carefully applied. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not tears yet, but pressure. The kind that comes when something private is suddenly public and you realize it's too late to put it back. My father stepped forward. "James." Uncle James raised one hand. "I'm not finished. Sarah never asked for recognition. That does not mean she did not deserve protection." Someone near the front table, one of my father's business partners, a surgeon, shifted in his seat. I recognized the look, professional discomfort, the kind that comes when ethics collide with familiarity. David did not need this money to survive. He needed it to remain comfortable. There is a difference. David finally turned. "This is inappropriate," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "This is family business." Uncle James met his eyes. "Then you should have treated it like family." Silence fell again, heavier now. "I am leaving Sarah my Intel stock portfolio, currently valued at $890,000. The number didn't register at first. It hung there, abstract, unreal. Then the room reacted. A sharp intake of breath, a chair scraping. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. David laughed once, short, disbelieving, like the sound itself might undo what he'd heard. Uncle James reached into his jacket and removed a second envelope. He handed it to me without ceremony. "Stock certificates," he said, "and documentation." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were copies of statements, notarized forms, and a handwritten note at the top in my grandmother's familiar script. "Use this to save yourself." I didn't look up. I couldn't. Uncle James continued reading. "I have asked James to wait for this moment because truth requires context. It requires witnesses. Sarah deserves both." My father's face had gone pale, not angry, exposed. People were looking at him differently now, not accusingly, not cruelly, but with the slow reassessment reserved for men whose stories have developed cracks. Uncle James folded the letter. "There's more," he said, "but the rest concerns timing." He turned toward me. "Sarah, do you want me to continue?" Every eye in the room shifted again. I could feel it, the expectation, the curiosity, the hunger for resolution. This was the moment stories pivoted, where silence could still smooth things over if I let it. I thought of the hospital bed, the texts, the spreadsheet, the word abuse written in careful handwriting on a yellow legal pad. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Continue." Uncle James nodded. He reached into his pocket and removed printed pages. "Before my mother passed," he said, "she asked me to hold on to documentation Sarah had never shown anyone." He lifted the first page. A financial ledger. The room stirred again. Uncle James read totals, dates, patterns. He didn't editorialize, he didn't need to. Numbers do that work on their own. Then he read the texts. Verbatim. "You're always so dramatic. Networking matters. Manage your stress better." I felt something rupture then. Not pain, not relief, but separation. like a cord snapping cleanly. Across the room, a woman I didn't know covered her mouth. One of my mother's friends stared down at her lap. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." My father said nothing. David's face flushed. "This is taken out of context," he said. "She chose to help." Uncle James nodded once. "Choice doesn't erase consequence." Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you, have you ever watched the truth surface in a room that was never built to hold it? If you have, comment, let it burn. Because this is the moment where sides form and there's no neutral ground left. The room had changed. Not loudly, subtly. People leaned away from my parents without realizing they were doing it. Conversations died before they could start. The applause that had filled the room earlier felt like it belonged to another event entirely. Uncle James lowered the papers. "That's all for now," he said. "The rest will be handled legally." Legally? The word echoed. My mother stood abruptly. "This is cruel," she said. "You've embarrassed us." I finally looked at her. "I didn't read the letter," I said. "I didn't write the texts. I didn't move the money back and forth." She opened her mouth, then closed it. David stepped toward me. "We'll talk later," he said, his voice tight. "Privately." I shook my head. "No," I said, "we won't." The certainty in my own voice surprised me. I held the envelope closer to my chest, not possessively, but protectively, like something fragile that had survived despite neglect. Around us, the room buzzed with restrained chaos. People checking watches, making excuses, avoiding eye contact. Uncle James touched my elbow. "You okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. And that was the truth. Because the inheritance wasn't the rupture. The rupture was realizing that the version of my family I'd been loyal to no longer existed, if it ever had. As people began to leave, quietly and quickly, I stood there with an envelope that could change my life and a room full of people who no longer knew how to look at me. What would happen next, who would speak, who would disappear, who would retaliate, was still unwritten. And for the first time in my life, the uncertainty wasn't terrifying. It was absolute. The room didn't explode after the letter. That surprised me. No shouting, no dramatic exits, no collapse to the floor, just a slow, collective withdrawal like oxygen being quietly removed. People stood, gathered purses and jackets, murmured excuses about early mornings and long drives. Goodbyes were brief. Eye contact was careful. Silence spread in pockets. The kind of silence that judges. My parents stayed near the head table, frozen in a posture that no longer fit. My father kept adjusting his cufflinks, a habit he had when he felt exposed. My mother whispered urgently to anyone who would lean in close enough to listen. David paced. Not far, just enough to burn off adrenaline without drawing attention. He checked his phone twice, then slid it back into his pocket, jaw set. Uncle James remained beside me, a quiet anchor. "You don't have to stay," he said softly. I looked around the room, the half-cleared tables, the untouched dessert plates, the banner that suddenly felt ironic. "I want to hear what they say," I replied. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Because up until then, this had been revelation. What came next would be reckoning. My father approached first, alone. "Sarah," he said, lowering his voice, "this wasn't the place for this." I met his eyes. "You chose the place," I said. "I didn't." He flinched barely. "You don't understand how this looks," he continued. "People will talk." "They already are," I said. "They just weren't talking to me." He exhaled slowly. "Your mother is devastated." "I was hospitalized," I said. "She called me dramatic." That ended the conversation. He nodded once, like a man conceding a point he couldn't refute, then stepped back toward my mother, who was now crying quietly into a napkin, surrounded by friends who didn't know how to comfort her without implicating themselves. David didn't come immediately. When he did, it was with purpose. "This is not over," he said, stopping in front of me. His voice was low, controlled. "You've humiliated us." I felt something click into place. Not anger, not fear. Finality. You humiliated yourselves, I said. I just stopped covering. He laughed once, sharp. You think this makes you right? No, I said. It makes me done. He stared at me, searching for the version of me that would soften, that would apologize for making things uncomfortable. He didn't find her. Uncle James stepped forward. Any further discussion can go through counsel, he said calmly. I suggest you leave. David hesitated, then turned away, shoulders rigid. The room continued to empty. As people passed me, reactions varied. A few squeezed my hand. A few avoided me entirely. One woman, a pediatrician I recognized from the hospital, met my eyes and nodded once, slow and respectful. That nod mattered more than applause ever could. When the staff began clearing tables in earnest, the event officially over, Uncle James guided me toward a quieter corner. You did exactly what she hoped you would, he said. Grandma, I asked. Yes, he said. You stood. I looked down at the envelope again, heavier now, not with money, but with consequence. Before I tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, I need to ask you something. Have you ever told the truth and realized it didn't bring relief, only space? If you have, comment worth it. Because this is the part people don't warn you about. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was procedural. Within days, my parents' friends stopped calling, not in protest, in recalibration. Invitations slowed. Dinners were postponed indefinitely. The lake house became a liability rather than a brag. My parents didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. When they finally did, it was through an email. Formal, careful, full of words like misunderstanding and context and family matters. No apology, no denial either. Just distance, reorganized. David's response came through attorneys. A cease and desist request regarding defamatory statements. It didn't go anywhere. Truth, when documented, is difficult to intimidate. At work, something unexpected happened. People treated me differently, not delicately, but honestly. A supervisor pulled me aside and adjusted my schedule without being asked. A colleague told me, quietly, that she'd started documenting her own finances after hearing what happened. I slept better. Not because everything was resolved, but because I wasn't carrying everyone else's weight anymore. The inheritance process began. Paperwork, transfers, meetings with financial advisors who spoke to me as if I were competent, not lucky. I set boundaries early. Conservative investments, emergency funds, education accounts for the twins. I didn't buy anything flashy. What I bought was margin. Time, rest, options. And yet, uncertainty lingered. My family was fractured, but not finished. David hadn't apologized. My parents hadn't acknowledged the harm. There were rumors, whispers of blame being redirected, of narratives being revised. I didn't know if retaliation would come quietly or loudly. I didn't know who would disappear permanently and who would attempt reconciliation. What I did know was this. Silence had protected them. Speaking had protected me. And once the truth is read into a room full of witnesses, it doesn't go back into the envelope. Weeks passed after the anniversary party, but not the kind of weeks that brought relief. They were measured, exacting, like a clock counting the slow consequences of truth. My family's world had fractured, and the tremors reached farther than anyone had expected. The hospital felt different when I walked in. Colleagues greeted me with subtle nods, an acknowledgement of what had happened without words. Dr. Rodriguez caught my eye across the nurses' station and offered a quiet smile, one that said, "You're seen now, and it matters." For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt that recognition wasn't transactional. It wasn't tied to what I gave or sacrificed, but to who I was. At home, the twins noticed changes too. Emma asked why Mommy didn't work double shifts anymore. Ethan handed me a drawing labeled Mommy's Time. They didn't need to understand the legal battles or spreadsheets. They only knew that I wasn't always exhausted, and that alone shifted their world. The financial aftermath was orderly but tense. The inheritance, once transferred, provided autonomy I had never had before. I didn't buy luxury cars or a mansion. Instead, I opened education accounts for the twins, stabilized emergency funds, and cautiously invested Grandma's Intel portfolio. Every decision was deliberate. Every dollar reclaimed was a statement that my life would no longer be dictated by others' expectations. Meanwhile, my parents' social circle began to contract without their conscious effort. Invitations diminished, lunches were canceled, and friends who once relied on family connections now stepped back. My mother's whispers to colleagues and distant family members became defensive, a subtle acknowledgement that the story had changed and she was no longer in control. David, however, was less constrained. He emailed, called, and attempted private meetings. He wanted the narrative back. He wanted control. I refused every contact. His strategy was clear: try to contain the fallout, manage optics, and maintain influence. But his usual tactics, charm, intimidation, and carefully curated status, no longer worked. The ledger, the texts, and Grandma's envelope were irrefutable evidence. Then came the first formal ripple of justice. Someone flagged his malpractice history, missed follow-ups, distracted patient care, and neglect tied to his luxury lifestyle. Investigations were initiated, privileges at multiple hospitals suspended. I didn't have to lift a finger. His mismanagement had consequences. His choices finally met their cost. I watched all of this quietly without gloating. Justice was not revenge. It was balance, slow, patient, and undeniable. I didn't need him to fail to feel whole. I only needed freedom, boundaries, and recognition of my own worth. At the same time, life demanded forward motion. The twins required attention, my patients required care, and my own well-being required boundaries I had never enforced before. The ledger of past sacrifices became a tool, a blueprint for self-preservation rather than shame. I planned schedules that honored rest, relationships, and responsibility. I mentored younger nurses about maintaining boundaries and financial awareness, ensuring that the lessons of my sacrifice could prevent another silent collapse. And yet, uncertainty persisted. My parents still avoided direct acknowledgement of harm. David's attempts at reconciliation were inconsistent and cautious. Social circles had shifted, but rumors and judgments still swirled. Every phone call from an attorney, every indirect contact, reminded me that clarity comes with friction, and freedom is never fully quiet. Before I move on to what would ultimately feel like resolution, I need to ask, have you ever faced the consequences of someone else's negligence or entitlement without a desire for revenge, only to feel the weight of inevitability? Comment, I see it, if you know that moment. Because this is the threshold where clarity is not comfort, it's responsibility. I began to understand the cost of seeing clearly. Clarity does not erase the past. It does not heal every relationship. It does not force accountability in those who refuse it. But it does allow you to rebuild with your own terms. The ledger was complete. The envelope had been opened. The truths were known, and I had survived them. For David, the consequences were visible. Reputation tarnished, hospital privileges under review, credibility diminished. For my parents, social perception had shifted. Invitations diminished. Friends whispered. Even the lake house, once a symbol of prestige, was sold and reassigned. The structures they depended on for ego and status no longer aligned with reality. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply continued living on my terms. The twins thrived in their school, my work was steady and respected, and I maintained boundaries that protected me from the patterns I had endured for 9 years. Yet redemption, true reconciliation, remained uncertain. David had expressed regret privately, but the proof of change would take time. My parents had yet to acknowledge their exploitation in any meaningful way. The ledger could document history, but it could not rewrite emotion. Some family fractures would heal, others might remain forever. The cost of seeing clearly is that you know who you are, but you also know who might never see you. That knowledge is both liberating and painful. As I closed the envelope one last time and placed it on the shelf, I felt the weight of what had passed and the potential of what remained. Freedom was mine, but trust and familial reconciliation were still tentative. I had clarity, and with it came choice: to engage, to forgive, to protect, or to simply observe. The ledger of sacrifices, the exposure, and the inheritance had shifted the balance. My life was mine to govern, but others, those who had caused harm, would need to find their own reckoning. And I understood this. Seeing clearly is not painless. It does not erase the years of invisibility, but it does prevent further exploitation. It allows life to be built deliberately, intentionally, consciously. The final tension remained. Could trust ever be rebuilt? Could love survive exposure and accountability? I did not yet know, and that uncertainty lingered like a pulse beneath everything I now controlled. This was the cost of seeing clearly: empowerment with caution, justice without cruelty, and freedom tethered to vigilance. The ledger was closed, the envelope secured, and I finally was free to move forward. But some questions, the deepest ones, remained unanswered. And in that space, life waited for the next choice. The first morning in my townhouse felt like a new calendar page being turned. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, catching dust motes in a quiet dance. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the twins' artwork taped to the wall in a chaotic collage that somehow felt like order. This was mine. Mine to control, mine to protect, mine to rebuild. After 9 years of invisible labor, 9 years of sacrifice, 9 years of carrying everyone else's weight, I was finally moving forward on my terms. Emma and Ethan ran in, barefoot, energy spilling like the sunlight. Emma had a drawing labeled Mommy's Day, full of flowers and smiling stick figures. Ethan carried his favorite toy car and tried to hand it to me. "For you," he said, "so you don't have to work too hard." My chest tightened because the truth was that for them, and finally for me, life could feel different. At work, the change was subtle but tangible. I had stopped double shifts, taken regular breaks, and returned to being the nurse I had always been, not the nurse who carried my family's financial burdens on top of patient care. Dr. Rodriguez caught my eye in the hallway and offered that quiet, understanding smile again, the one that said, "You made it through, and it matters." It felt almost miraculous. The legal and financial outcomes unfolded in parallel. Grandma's Intel portfolio was officially mine. With it, I set up a scholarship for aspiring nurses in her name, something meaningful that wasn't about luxury but legacy. I balanced investments, education funds, and emergency savings. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't buy a new car. I bought autonomy, time, options, life on my terms. David's downfall, slow but inexorable, began to solidify. Malpractice claims, distracted patient care, and missed follow-ups resulted in his privileges being suspended at multiple hospitals. Reputation tarnished. Business associates who once praised him quietly withdrew. I didn't have to lift a finger. The truth, finally visible, had consequences he couldn't charm or manipulate away. And yet, I never celebrated. Justice, I realized, isn't the same as revenge. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing him stumble. It was in reclaiming my life. In the quiet knowledge that for once, the narrative wasn't being written by someone else. My parents approached cautiously, still unsure of boundaries. They asked questions about the estate, about finances, about family matters. I answered minimally. No apologies, no admissions of past harm, only clarity and firmness. Their social influence had diminished subtly but noticeably. Invitations decreased. Friendships realigned. They were learning slowly that manipulation no longer worked. David called eventually, privately, his voice trembling, careful. I didn't know," he said. "I never realized how much you gave up. I'm in therapy." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react with anger. When he finished, I said simply, "Then be better, that's the proof I need." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't restored trust. But it was a start. And sometimes a start is all that matters. Life's rhythm returned. The twins thrived in school, their curiosity and laughter filling the townhouse. I worked normal hours, kept weekends free, and built a quiet but firm network of colleagues and friends who respected my boundaries. I began mentoring younger nurses, teaching them financial awareness, boundary setting, and the courage to be visible without exploitation. Every lesson was a quiet rebellion against the years I had spent invisible. Dr. Rodriguez and I grew closer, slowly, intentionally. Partnership without pressure, without neediness, without the ghosts of past sacrifice dictating our dynamic. We laughed at dinner, debated patient care protocols, and planned small adventures that had nothing to do with status, Instagram, or social expectation. The lake house, once a symbol of family pride and competition, was sold. My parents moved to a modest condo. David's practice, while operational, was now tempered by scrutiny. Consequences were real, but they were not my victory. They were the natural result of truth being finally witnessed. Still, there was a lingering uncertainty. My parents had yet to admit fully the exploitation I had endured. David's personal growth, while evident in therapy and volunteer work, was still fragile. Some dinners would remain awkward. Some conversations would never fully reconcile. I paused one evening, sitting at the kitchen island, twins asleep, the envelope from Grandma on the counter. I held the stock certificates, thinking about her foresight, not just in wealth, but in understanding my worth. She had given me more than money. She had given me visibility, permission, and a chance to reclaim my narrative. And yet one question remained. Would they ever truly see me, not the giver, not the good daughter, not the quiet provider, but me fully and unfiltered? I didn't know. I smiled softly. Perhaps I never would receive that full acknowledgement. Perhaps the story of who I was and what I had done would always sit partly unseen. But that uncertainty no longer terrified me. In it, there was a quiet liberation. Before I close this chapter, I need to ask you something. Have you ever reclaimed your life and realized that not everyone around you will acknowledge it? Comment, "I choose me," if you understand that tension. Because some victories are silent, private, and deeply personal. The ledger was closed. The envelope was secured. The twins slept. My boundaries were intact. My life, painstakingly rebuilt, was now mine. And in that reclamation, I discovered the most valuable truth. Being seen by yourself is more important than being validated by others. But life wasn't static. Every day would bring new choices, small tests of boundaries, and quiet confrontations with old patterns. The story of my family and me was not over, not fully. That unresolved thread lingered, subtle and insistent. How would we navigate the future now that the past could never be ignored? And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Because freedom, I realized, is not a moment. It is ongoing. And truth, even when it cannot guarantee forgiveness or understanding, is always worth claiming. I set the envelope down and looked out the window. The city hummed below. My twins' laughter still echoed faintly from the other room. Life was continuing, imperfect, unsteady, beautiful. And I knew the story could continue. If someone were watching, they would see a woman who survived, who reclaimed herself, and who refused to be small. The ledger was closed, the envelope returned to its place, but the future, fluid, uncertain, and full of potential, waited. And in that waiting, there was hope. Not the tidy kind, not the kind that resolves everything, but the kind that endures. And for now, that was enough.